Herzlich willkommen. Der Klimawandel ist eines der dominierenden Themen unserer Zeit. Die Regierungen der westlichen Welt und die Wissenschaftsgemeinschaft sind sich scheinbar einig darin, dass der Wandel des Klimas hauptsächlich menschengemacht ist. Das, obwohl Klima ein hochkomplexes, nicht lineares und chaotisches System ist und die Voraussagen alle auf Modellen beruhen, deren Genauigkeit zweifelhaft ist. Kritik an der Klimakrise wird als Leugnung oder unwissenschaftlich bewertet. Es wird wieder einmal Angst geschürt, statt informiert und debattiert, und wieder einmal beinhalten die Lösungsvorschläge vor allem Zentralismus und globale Strategien, die weniger Freiheiten für die Menschen und mehr Kontrolle für Regierungen zur Folge haben könnten. Auf meiner Suche nach aktiven Wissenschaftlern zu diesem Thema bekam ich viele Absagen. Aufgrund des aufgeheizten Klimas rund um dieses Thema. Ich suchte weiter und fand den ehemaligen Professor für geologische Wissenschaften der Universität Alabama, Dr. Matthew Wielicki. Mit ihm sprach ich über die Erwärmung der Erde, den menschlichen Einfluss darauf, die Arbeit des Weltklimarates und wie ein wissenschaftlicher und realistischer Umgang mit dem sich stetig wandelnden Klima aussehen könnte. Das Gespräch fand in Englisch statt und ist mit deutschen Untertiteln versehen. Ich wünsche ein aufschlussreiches Gespräch.
Absolutely. So, I think what you're doing is great. So let me just start with that. I think that keeping this dialogue open is very healthy. There's no science that is ever, or any problem that's ever solved when people shut each other down. It's always solved by coming together and bringing lots of different expertise and lots of different backgrounds and conflicting ideas, but then sitting at the table and talking about them. And you're all going for the same goal. I think the goal is to have a planet that is sustainable and can I have children. And so I think all of our goals are the same. We just have different ways of approaching it, and we're measuring risk different. And so we should keep that dialogue open because, there's no right answer in science. But ultimately, my background is in geochemistry, and I did a PhD at UCLA. My father was an academic, so I always wanted to go into academia. That was pretty much the goal since probably age 12. And I was very lucky to land a position at the University of Alabama as a tenure track position. And I started to notice pretty quickly that the academia that I kind of remember growing up around with my father in the 80s and maybe even in the 90s, it was very different. I saw that change occurring while I was getting my PhD, but you're kind of separated from the faculty and everything. And once I got to the university, I noticed that there was a lot of what I called illiberalism. It was the opposite of what I kind of thought the university system was founded on, which was this kind of open exchange of ideas, and nothing is taboo. Everything is discussed. The way that we win is we compete in the game of ideas, and our ideas are better, and that's why people come along with us. But some people might not, and that's okay too. And we'll argue and we'll be heated at each other, but then we'll go have a beer afterwards. This is we're trying to find out the right answer, so we're all kind of trying to come to the truth. That was the ultimate goal of kind of academia and science in general. But it became very clear that there was things that you couldn't talk about, and so there was issues, for example, like climate change. And as an academic in earth sciences, this was definitely taboo to talk about. And discussing these things was essentially career suicide. I already knew I was leaving, so I felt like I could openly discuss it because the termination of my position was already decided 2 years prior. And when I started to discuss it, it was very clear that I was correct because my department was getting emails. The chair of my department was getting bombarded with emails. I mean, people were posting things to the university, to the provost, on social media about claims that I was making, even though what I was doing was citing scientific literature that the mainstream media seemed to be ignoring because it didn't fit in the narrative and it complicates things. And unfortunately, that's where people kind of gloss over and they lose interest, because if it's complicated and there's a lot of nuance and details, well, that's not easy to package into a little story for the media. And so I started to kind of wade into these waters, and I was definitely, it was clear to me that, this would have been career suicide. Like you said, we were already leaving because we grew up in California. We had family, all of our family was in California, and Alabama was so far away. COVID made us realize we wanted to be closer to family. But it made it easy to walk away from a position where, the whole beauty of it to me was this freedom of exchange of ideas. That's what made me be a passionate academic, was disappearing very quickly. So it made it easy for me to kind of turn my back and walk away. And thankfully, there's a lot of other opportunities for academics to share information now that didn't exist just a few years ago. Like you mentioned, my Substack, Irrational Fear. So, it's an interesting transition, but hopefully I can continue to share, talk about science and inform people about science.
Yeah, I mean, part of that is our conversation now here. And you already touched upon some things that I wanted to ask you, because I often hear that when it comes to climate change, there is basically a scientific consensus. And we often hear that number, 97% of literature or of scientists are sure that basically the man-made CO2 emissions are the main reasons for global warming. And now there is some scientists, like maybe you, that are not part of this consensus, or this consensus doesn't even exist, that I don't know. So what is your take on this consensus about climate change?
So we've seen in science in general that the word consensus tends to be used when the evidence to support the theory is weak. And that consensus tends to be a way to push those that maybe disagree out, and thus try to build up more what would appear evidence for a certain theory than what would really actually be there. The 97% number that you talk about comes from the Australian group paper in 2013, Cook et al. And if you actually look at the paper, what they concluded was that 97% of the scientists surveyed thought that humans had some effect on the climate or surface temperature in general. They grouped together those that thought that human anthropogenic emissions were a main driver, and those that thought that the evidence just wasn't clear. They grouped those two together. And so I think that that's true. I think that there is a 97% consensus that in earth science, that the scientists think that humans have an effect on the environment. I think that's absolutely true. I think where there's a lot of disagreement is whether that effect is on the 5 or 10% range, where maybe radical transitions in policy and things, we should only expect a 5 to 10% change in that effect because that's what we're having. That's the effect that we're having on the climate. So if we change that effect, that's what we should expect. Or are we having something like 80 or 90% effect, and thus having this radical change will somehow change things by 80, 90% in the future? And so I think that's where there is a lot of discrepancy, and there is absolutely no consensus. I tend to fall on the side where I think that natural variability and things like events like the eruptions that happened in Tonga last year, these things can throw monkey wrenches into the whole system. So it's very difficult to predict these things. Thus, I kind of think that our influence on the climate is probably relatively less than maybe what the IPCC would think. But absolutely, there is no consensus that humans are the main drivers of changes in the surface temperature in the scientific community.
Hmm. And your opinion, when I follow, for example, German news, we have young people right now being glued to the streets because they are thinking they are the last generation. I actually had a talk with some climate activists about that, because I wanted to open up the dialogue, because I don't think that they are bad people because they are afraid. And so let's dive into this narrative. I've looked up a quote that is pretty new, and it's by the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. And he said, the era of global warming has ended and the era of global boiling has arrived. So he makes it even stronger. So let me ask you some simple questions for people that are not really deep into this topic. Is the Earth getting warmer? And how is a global average temperature being measured? How can you actually say the Earth is getting warmer?
Yeah, so two really important questions, great questions. So is the Earth getting warmer? I think we can conclusively say that the Earth has been getting warmer essentially continuously since the last glacial maximum. That's about 18,000 years ago. We have tons of evidence of this from the geologic record because we see that there's evidence of glaciers over the UK, or for example, modern day where New York City is, and northern portions of North America, all of Canada. So we've got good evidence that the planet's essentially been warming. We've seen sea levels have been continuously rising on the order of over 120 meters since that time period. So significant changes. Now, when people talk about recent warming, usually what we're talking about is warming since about 1850. And 1850 is a interestingly cool period of that occurred, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere. It's known as the Little Ice Age. And I would say that most places on the planet have been warming steadily since 1850. Come around the 1970s or so, we have a satellite record. And we're starting to measure now, we're measuring the surface temperature and the tropospheric temperature, so the temperature of the lower atmosphere from satellites. And it appears that there is some warming that has occurred there on the order of about 1 degree Celsius or so since the late 19th century, maybe 1.1, people argue. So now what is this meaning? Does this have any meaning? What is this number? This number is essentially an average of all of the surface temperatures. And so you have to think about how we average numbers. So we have really a lot of weight put into areas where we have a lot of people, and those people live in developed countries. For example, Western Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, areas where we have modern instruments, there's a lot of infrastructure, we've set up weather stations all over the place. And so there we have a lot of good coverage. In a lot of places that are in the developing world, we have very little coverage. And in the oceans, which cover 70% of the land surface, we have even less coverage. And so what we're ultimately doing is we have very dense data sets in certain areas of the globe. We have very little data sets in other areas of the globe. And so we try to interpolate between these data points, and we make estimates in between. And so when I made an estimate that we have a good idea of about the surface temperature on about 4% of the planet, and we estimate the other 96%. We know that in that 4%, the satellites do a decent job. They're not great. It depends sometimes on the amount of clouds. It depends on the amount of humidity. So you kind of need the ground truth of the surface instruments to verify the satellite instruments. So I would argue that we have about 4% idea of a global average temperature. We estimate 96%. But then again, what does this metric even mean? What does the average phone number in the phone book mean? That might not even be a number that actually dials to a number. That it might have decimal places and places. So does this number that we talk about, that we focus on so dramatically, does it have any meaning? If you're in one of these areas that's cooled, there's significant portions of the planet that have cooled as well. Just when you average everything, there's a slight increase. Would you be worried about global warming, right? And so it's just a way that reduces a really complex system with a lot of variability into a single metric, which is easy and nice to package for the media, but really ultimately doesn't have much meaning scientifically.
So you just stated that there is warming, and we can it's not clear as to how much exactly it is, but I oftentimes hear that the warming that is occurring would lead to mass migration, starving, extreme weather events. So it doesn't matter if it's man-made or not, but there is a warming tendency. Is that a catastrophe for the planet and its inhabitants, or what does this warming mean for the inhabitants
That's right.
of this
See,
Earth?
this is the most important question, because and this is something that you'll see that the IPCC and many of the climate alarming community have kind of shifted away from the temperature, the warming, because people are kind of like, well, wait a minute, let's look at in history, like for example, where we were just talking about the Little Ice Age. That was a time period in Northern Europe that was very hard. There was starvation, there was huge disease. We know through the recorded history of just the human civilization that warm periods tend to be time periods of flourishing, of human flourishing, of advancement, of expanding into new terrains. And then when we go into these cold periods, that's when we really suffer. That's when so we have to kind of make that connection. We have to disconnect just whether the temperature changes, because the geologic record is clear. The temperature has never been stable. So we just have to accept, if we're going to continue to live on the planet, and we accept that the last 4.5 billion years are a good data set for the future 4.5 billion years, because in about 4.5 billion years, the sun should go red giant, and that it will all be over then anyway, then we should expect temperature to always change, because it's clear in the geologic record that there's been never a time of stability. And so we should just forget about that. So the temperature is going to change. So then what's better, cold or warm? Well, warm is clearly better. In the human record, warm is better. In the geologic or the fossil record, warm is better. Warm leads to a higher biodiversity of animals and plants. Warm leads to a larger expanse, geographic expanse of animals and plants, where they can actually, the niches of environment that they can exploit. So it's clear that warm is better. Now, does warm come with all of these terrible consequences like severe weather attachments and everything like that? Well, there's two ways to look at this problem. You can look at what the IPCC does and make a bunch of assumptions and model things and make predictions for the future. Okay, in those predictions, they say that warming will come with catastrophic events. Like you said, mass migration. They talk about billions of people dying. I say, okay, that's a model. That's not scientific to me because I can't test it. It's unfalsifiable. And in science, in the scientific method, I have to test your hypothesis. So the way that I'm going to test your hypothesis is I'm going to look back in history for the last 1.1 degrees of warming, which I think everybody pretty much accepts we've had. And let's see whether or not we're seeing mass migrations, or are we seeing an increase in people losing their life from climate-related natural disasters? Or are we seeing effects in agriculture? So if we do that, what we see is significant decreases in the amount of people that die from natural disasters. We see that increase in CO2 has dramatically increased the yield per hectare of agricultural output. We see that there has been no mass migration. In fact, there's been an uptick recently because of socioeconomic and war issues. But over the last century, migrants have actually decreased dramatically. We've lifted billions of people out of poverty. What people used to wait in bread lines, people now wait in iPhone lines. The human condition has significantly improved. It doesn't mean that there aren't people suffering. There's 2.1 billion people on the planet that don't have access to clean drinking water. But in the Western world, should we be worrying about the temperature in 2100 and some models, or should we be thinking about lifting those people out of poverty? Because it's clear that the last 1.1 degrees of warming haven't had any catastrophic effects. Why should the next 1.1 degrees?
That is a good question. And that is maybe will lead us to assumptions why this narrative is being pushed so strong. Let's go to another point that is really important, because we talk about or at least politics and scientists in Germany do it all the time, that the man-made CO2 emission is the only or the main reason for global warming. And I would like to know from you, how secure or how evident, how strong of a fact or a statement is that hypothesis?
So it's such a difficult one to categorize, because so I guess main would mean 51%. That, I guess that's what that would mean. You know, we just can't measure things to that level of certainty. Do I think human emissions have some effect? Absolutely. I think that human emissions do have some effect. Whether we can untangle natural variability from human forcing to the level that we could confidently make a statement like that, I just don't think that the science supports making a statement like that. And I think if you read what the IPCC working assessments say, they also wouldn't say that. It's when it gets to the policymakers, it's when it gets from the scientists' hands to the policy and the bureaucrats' hands, that you start to see the verbiage change. And then when it gets into the mainstream media, it becomes an almost certainty. And there's somehow a disconnect. And my biggest problem is that the scientific community isn't more vocal, that it's not really accurate to make a statement like that. We don't have the accurate understanding of the system, which is chaotic and which is very complicated, such that we could make a statement like that very confidently. And if you can't make a statement like that very confidently, then your whole policy efforts fall apart. So they have to make a statement like that. They're required to, because ultimately they're driving policy change. But I would argue that if an honest look, and if you talk to any sort of scientist that isn't really involved in the policy making or anything like that, they would say that no amount or no evidence currently exists that we could make a confident statement to support that.
And so you've referred now several times to the IPCC. Maybe we can, IPCC is the International Panel for Climate Change, and it's a very relevant body, basically.
International Governmental Panel. Remember,
exactly.
Governmental, it's bureaucrats and policymakers. It's not scientists. They employ scientists, but ultimately it's run by government institutions.
Okay, and but it's fair to say it's a relevant body for politics, and I have read some of their, their publications, but one or two things that I had questions about. I read some things that, for example, the IPCC and the model they're using, they're not including things like cloud variation and sun. So maybe you, I mean, probably you know more about these things. How would you view the work of the IPCC? Are they including all necessary things for their models? How do the models work? What's your take on this?
So the models essentially work by taking the surface of the Earth and the atmosphere and cutting it up into little squares. And by little, we mean multiple kilometer squares, so such that a computer can kind of treat these things as little individual slices. And then you can kind of track and follow along what's happening in these individual little squares. You could track the moisture content, the temperature, but in order to do that, you have to make fundamental assumptions about the physics of nature and how these things fundamentally interact and what are the feedback loops and things like that. So it's very complicated. When we talk about climate, we call it a coupled, nonlinear, chaotic system. So coupled means that you can't define it by a single equation. You need to have multiple equations. Nonlinear means that it's not each change of a single variable doesn't have the same proportional change on another variable. For example, like a line equation, you know exactly how X will change when you change Y. And chaotic means that if you want to look at past records, you can't really tease out any patterns because there's no real reproducibility. There's some cyclicity here and there, but we can't really see a pattern such that we could say, oh, here's what the future is going to look like because here's the pattern of the past. That's what the chaotic part is. And so the models do as best as they can, but because they are on such a coarse grid scale, multiple kilometers. They fail to do things like accurately model the nucleation of clouds, like you just mentioned. And the nucleation of clouds is really, really important because water vapor is by far the dominant greenhouse gas, not only in concentration. Remember, we talk about CO2 on the order of parts per million. Water vapor, we talk about percentages. And also because has a much greater ability to absorb infrared radiation in terms of its spectrum than CO2 or methane or any of the other greenhouse gases. So it's the dominant greenhouse gas. And so if you have trouble modeling how clouds nucleate, and it's the dominant, and you admit, the models admit, and all the climate scientists freely admit, that water vapor is the dominant greenhouse gas, you have a big problem because you're openly admitting that you don't have the resolution to model the number one driver of the greenhouse effect, which is essentially what you're trying to measure. So it's not that they don't do this, it's that they're incapable of doing it at the moment. They're still trying and they're getting better, and people are working, really smart people are working at this stuff. And I think my PhD advisor always reminded me, he's a National Academy of Sciences member. He always reminded me, he said, Matt, remember, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And that's really important, and it's important. But this is we shouldn't throw models out the window. And models are going to be useful. They're important, but we also shouldn't put all our eggs in the basket of models, because we should understand that models are based on assumptions. And if those assumptions are flawed, or if the model is incapable of doing something because of, for example, resolution, then we have to understand those limitations. And maybe we shouldn't be putting all of our policy decisions on models that we freely admit don't fully understand the system.
And so you just said that the IPCC is governmental. So when you read those IPCC publications, and there's always several publications, one that's very long, and then there's short ones just for people making decisions. When you read the long ones, do you actually read, and can you tell how the scientists working for the IPCC are telling that they are unsafe, insecure, they don't really know, but they can only assume, and then that message gets filtered or gets changed into, no, we know it's 1.5 degrees and it's safe. And so it's not the scientists being, I don't know, overconfident, but it's kind of a change what's happening there by politics. Is that?
Yes. So I don't know if you guys in Europe have a game when you play as kids called the game of telephone, where you whisper a sentence into one person's ear and then they whisper it into another. And by the time it gets to like the fifth person, the sentence is completely different. It's totally different. That's essentially what's happening. What the publications that you're talking about are the working assessments. So the working assessments are essentially published by the scientists. The chair of the writing committee is still, it's an economist, Dr. Lee from Korea. Very, very smart man. It appears very, very accomplished, but he's an economist. Ultimately, he's a policy person. He's on that side, but he's the chair of the writing committee. But most of the working assessments are written by the scientists. And then what happens is because those are long and they have tons of verbiage, scientific verbiage in them, and they're using a lot of words like could, may, possibly does, all these words that are essentially qualifiers for how uncertain they are. When you see these things being changed over to what's called the summary for policymakers, which tends to be what the media picks up on and was what most of the policy actually makers read, that very kind of uncertain terminology disappears, and it becomes a much more catastrophic type of situation. And you see, and it's been shown that the IPCC has worked with social scientists to work on what kind of language they should use, such that they elicit emotional responses. Because ultimately what they want in the executive summary is an emotional response from the public and from policymakers, because we know, or social science has shown, that if you can drive people's emotional responses, that's a good way to make them change behaviors. And if the ultimate goal is to essentially change our behaviors from what we eat, to when we fly, to how we travel, to what kind of cars we use, then fear and emotional responses are good at driving those behavioral changes. So I think there's a huge disconnect between the working assessment from the scientists and the executive summary. But I also blame the scientific community for not saying, hey, guys, wait a minute. You're kind of bastardizing our words. You're taking our words and you're twisting them. But they're like, well, this will bring more funding. Look at all the media coverage we're getting. Look at all of this notoriety. Maybe we just won't really say anything and we'll bite our tongue because, ultimately this is just increasing our notoriety.
And so if I understand you correct, that the scientists reading it and writing it are aware of the discrepancy between what they publish and what politics made of their statement. But they don't get vocal about it because of their own fear of losing funding or career or whatever.
It would be impossible for me to suspect otherwise, because what's said in the executive summary is very different than what is said in the working assessments. If they actually read it, I know they would see the glaring discrepancies between what they actually said and what the words that were put out to the media.
And I wanted to pick out one aspect of this whole narrative that seems important, because nowadays, whenever there is a weather event in Germany, like there's a strong rain or there's some, not snow doesn't get coverage, but if it's really hot or really dry, we hear that this is related to climate change. And I always wonder how weather events in parts of the country can be so easily connected to a global climate change. So I wanted to ask you, is there a clear connection between climate change and extreme weather events?
Absolutely not. So what you're talking about is the new phenomenon called attribution studies. In fact, I think the World Attribution Center is in Europe somewhere. I forget exactly where. And they do a rapid response essentially to every weather event. And they make statements like, the rains in Libya were made 50 times more likely by climate change. That is absolutely unscientific. Even the IPCC clearly states that currently we see no effect in precipitation from increasing in surface temperatures. So this is completely unscientific. What this does is this is a crystal ball. This assumes that they would know how strong a certain hurricane was coming in on a certain day in some hypothetical environment if humans didn't exist and if there was no greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. There is absolutely no way we know that. There is no scientific model that allows us to understand what the planet would look like if we weren't here. It just doesn't exist. The only thing we can do is we can look in the past and we can see, for example, are hurricanes getting stronger? Are rain events getting stronger? And it is absolutely clear that there has been no trend, and IPCC is very clear about this in the AR6 report. I encourage everyone to look at it. It's in chapter 6, it's table 12.12, and it lays out in one nice table where we have evidence that there's trends that appear to be an increasing or decreasing trends, and we think it could be attributable to climate change, and where we don't. And out of the 16 categories or so, something like 12 or now I forget. You have to go look at it. It's something like it's 80% of the metrics that they're looking at currently, they cannot determine if there is a trend either up or down in the observed historical data since we've been putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So these attribution studies are completely unscientific. They go against what the IPCC is even saying, and they're not peer reviewed, so they don't actually have to go through the peer reviewed literature. So these things, this is media, just perfect media bait, because they could rapidly respond to things. They can put these things out there, but I think these attribution studies are worth less than the paper that they're printed on.
And are there any other aspects of this discussion where you seem to see the biggest discrepancy between facts and evidence and what is being published or what is being said in the media? Is there any more examples where you always see like, hey, this is not true, this is not science? Are there any other aspects you think are
Yeah,
important?
the biggest one I think is what you're hitting on is this. They've moved away from warming. Warming doesn't seem to be the big issue anymore because people are just kind of like, well, it's warmed already a degree. It kind of feels nicer in a lot of places because some places are pretty cold. And so, maybe it's welcome quite a few places in, Northern Europe, a degree of warming. So they've shifted to this extreme weather and this human suffering. And those connections just don't exist yet. It doesn't mean that they won't. It doesn't mean that they're incorrect. But I just, the current observable as evidence in the 1.1 degrees of warming that we've had doesn't show any increase in these catastrophic events. In fact, we're protecting people from floods and from natural disasters a ton because we're building infrastructure. We realize that there's certain places that are prone to getting big of rain events. So what do? Well, we build dams and we build infrastructure to protect cities. We need huge machines to do that. We need lots of material to do that. We need to consume materials to do that. So this idea that if we somehow stop building infrastructure and we just stop actually protecting ourselves, because the Western world has done great. If you look, the Western world, almost nobody, loses their life from extreme weather events today. The people that do tend to be the people that stayed behind and didn't heed warnings and things like that. But everybody has plenty of time and warning to get out. Now, earthquakes and things like that are different, but I mean, climate related systems. We're so much better at protecting people in the Western world. Why? Because we have infrastructure, because we have energy. We need this energy and this infrastructure to protect people. We've done a great job already, and I don't understand why we wouldn't keep doing that. This idea that pulling back and hoping that the weather will change and not, trying to protect people and worrying about human suffering is crazy to me. They predict human suffering in the future. I'm showing human suffering now and saying that if we use a little bit more material, if we invest and let these people develop fossil fuels, they'll eventually transition like we are currently doing, but we need to bring them out of poverty. We can't expect them to jump from, cooking with yak dung to cooking with induction cooktops and copper pot, and beautiful fancy cooktops that you can buy for hundreds of dollars. That's just that's not a progression that's realistic. That will lead to people suffering for decades longer than they need to. So, let's not try to implement our Western conservation values onto developing nations. We can start to transition from these fossil fuels. We already are. It seems like young people don't think it's happening fast enough. I always ask them, it's interesting when they're gluing themselves to paintings, they're using glue that's made out of petroleum. I'm like, you wouldn't even be able to glue yourself to that painting if it wasn't for fossil fuels. And so, it's just, those connections don't exist. Humans aren't suffering because of fossil fuels. Humans are suffering because of a lack of access to energy. That's why humans suffer. And for us to sit in the Western world with all of this energy infrastructure and tell those people that they shouldn't, exploit their energy infrastructure because we're worried what the temperature might be for our great grandkids. I just find it so hypocritical. It's such a, it's just crazy that that's the moral high ground that we stand on now, and to look down on these poor people and tell them that they shouldn't be, developing their infrastructure. It's just, that's probably the biggest disconnect. This idea of human suffering, that more people will suffer if we don't rapidly shift away from energy infrastructure, where it's clear that people are suffering today because they have lack of energy infrastructure. So that's the biggest disconnect.
And just, you already said it, people are starving or not having good water to drink. And that's a problem that could be solved if there's a political will.
You
Now
don't
we're
even need
gonna
much political will. That could be solved. You could solve that in a decade with one hundredth of the energy and money that's going in to decarbonizing the economy.
Hmm.
I just made those numbers up, but I just mean a very small amount of
A fraction.
yeah, a
Yeah.
fraction, exactly.
So I want to go with you in a field that we probably can't know for sure, but I mean, it seems obvious that there's a big gap between what is evident and what is politically wanted and also propagated. And just today, I listened to a talk. Bill Gates was invited, and there was a New York Times event, I think, about climate change. And he said that he pays 10 million US dollars a year for his own CO2 emissions. And then he was asked, well, what about planting trees and CO2? And he said, well, that's complete nonsense. And that's a quote. I'm not making this up. So there's a lot of people out there, a lot of rich people, influential people that are talking about climate change, but their own CO2 emissions by their own standard would disqualify them from talking about it. That's my own judgment of that. But so we have basically stakeholders, maybe that's the frame that they would also use, that are pushing this agenda. I would call it an agenda now. And if the evidence of it is not as clear as you now described it, so what's their reason for being so invested into this? I mean, I know this is now guesswork a little bit, but there's also evidence for them being very involved in this.
Yeah, I mean, I find it very interesting. I don't know if you saw, there's a great little video of a husband who comes back and his wife's like, you're cheating on me. And he's like, no. I bought cheating offsets. So every time I actually cheat on you, I buy offsets. I'm making sure that Jim over here, his marriage doesn't break apart. So he's happily married. I know I'm cheating on you, but I'm buying these offsets. It's so hilarious. It's just, these are these ideas of these are rules for thee, but not for me. This goes back to this aristocracy, this idea of like nobles and kings and peasants. And, it's so crazy to me that it recently, actually just the other day, a Bloomberg article came out that showed that something like the vast majority, over 80% of those offset credits are junk. They're just garbage. It's just basically, you might as well just burn the money. They're doing nothing. It's just some way for Bill Gates to virtue signal that although he's flying around in his private jet and telling everyone they need to start driving electric vehicles and they can't travel as much as he does, maybe one trip every 2 years I saw now or something like that. He's an exception, right? So he doesn't have to do it because he's going to buy these offsets. And it just makes me think of, imagine so I used to live in Somalia, in Mogadishu in the late 80s. I just think about those kids and like Bill Gates out there jet setting around telling them that they're going to have to stay in poverty for a lot longer because they're not going to be able to develop all the fossil fuel resources they have. But for him, it's okay because look, he's investing all this money, right? This is totally a privileged stance. This is privileged for the Western world to think about it. It's privileged for those young people to glue themselves to a painting. If these kids in Somalia where I used to live, they don't have an option to go glue themselves to a painting because they got to walk 4 kilometers to get water. And then they come back and they tend the animals and then they do this. They have chores and they got to figure everything out. They don't have time to go flying from California to New York to protest in the streets in front of whatever bank they're protesting in front of and glue themselves to a building. What a privilege it is, right? And what a privilege it is for Bill Gates to go jet setting around. So these people are making money on this. Let's not pretend that Bill Gates is doing this because he doesn't think that there's a profit margin in it. There's a profit in vaccines and there's a profit in climate because both of these things, or healthcare and climate, because both of these things they drive emotion. And he knows that. And he's investing in that material. And he's not going to change his own life. He doesn't really think it's as big of a problem for him to actually make the sacrifices himself. Of course, that would require maybe just Zoom a couple times instead of jumping in his private jet and flying to you to do this interview. But he doesn't. He just pays a couple $100,000 to some imaginary account, pats himself on the back and says he's investing in some carbon offsets somewhere. Some scam artist is just putting that money into their pocket. And then he jumps in his plane and flies off and does some interviews. And so I just find it absolutely hypocritical. I think ultimately it will be the downfall of the whole climate thing, because nobody's willing to make the sacrifices that they claim everybody has to make. And so once this hypocrisy just is so evident in everybody's face, as it's clearly becoming, people just get so fed up. And just imagine, we're getting fed up with what Bill Gates is doing. Imagine if you're in a poorer country, a developing country, and you're seeing all of these kids who, with their Starbucks in one hand and their hand glued to a painting in the other hand. I mean, this will turn the majority of the world's population off from this stuff. And I think that they're going to see us in the Western world as some white knights, coming to save them. And in order to do that, we have to keep them in poverty while we enjoy the benefits of a Western lifestyle, which, uses a lot of energy. So I just find it absolutely hypocritical. I think he does it because he sees a profit in it.
Mm. But there's also governments being interested in this politic. It's not just private philanthropists like Bill Gates.
Oh, well, that's easy. Climate is the ultimate umbrella. Climate is everything. Climate is what you eat. Climate is what you drive. Climate is where you work. Climate is how you work. Climate is healthcare. Climate is the ultimate umbrella for government to be involved in every aspect of your life. And government, and I don't think, I'm not an anarchist. I think I'm someone that's for limited government. I think that people and local communities usually do better at kind of deciding what's best for them than large centralized governments. And maybe that's because I came from Eastern Europe. I was born behind the Iron Curtain. And so I have a little bit of a radar for socialist and central planning ideas. But governments see climate as the ultimate way to involve themselves in every aspect of human life. This is the ultimate way to get involved. And so they love it. A government, and ultimately government wants to be in power. That's, and I don't think it's people just in general wanting it. It's just the institution is built to try to harness as much power as possible. That's kind of how the institution exists. And so this becomes a perfect way to get involved in everybody's life. And so this becomes a way you can tax things that you never could have taxed before. I don't see it crazy to hear about taxes on breath. It's 50,000 ppm coming out of CO2, coming out of my breath right now. That's a lot of pollution. If we're going to consider CO2 a pollution, that's a lot of pollution, right? So climate for the government, I think, is the ultimate umbrella to get involved, to tax things. It's perfect for government because it's everything. And so that's why I think governments like it. They don't, for a government to say, look, maybe the climate change debate isn't as catastrophic as possible, means maybe I don't need to push these policies where you give up a little bit more of your freedom. So they're never going to say that. They're going to say, look, this stuff is catastrophic. You should give up a little bit more of your freedom. And as humans, we know that when we're afraid, we give up freedom. We saw that in the US after 9/11. After 9/11, we had the Patriot Act, and we all kind of said, look, we don't really like this, especially as in the US. The government's going to have open rights to spy on us and things like that. But we're scared. People are attacking us. So we're going to willingly give up this freedom. And so I think governments see that. They see pushing fear as a way to gain more power. So they are all on board.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. But most of the people I know are still hesitant to accept just the thought that government is actually scaring them on purpose to create policy or to change behavior. But
okay, but it's not the government per se. I don't think it's a plan. I think that, so for example, on my Substack, I'm writing right now, I'm looking at the 10 most newsworthy climate papers over the last decade. And what you see is that the most catastrophic stuff tends to get the most notoriety, the most clicks, the most news, the most policymakers talking about it. So it's just human nature that we kind of we think about the bad stuff more than the not so bad, or maybe even the good things like CO2 fertilization, increasing yield of agriculture. So it's kind of human nature. So I don't think it's necessarily a plan. There's no secret plan. That's is why I'm not much of a conspiracy theorist. I don't think this is a conspiracy. This is just human nature. This is just kind of how we are, but we should be aware of that and make sure that our guard is up such that we don't allow that, which maybe is some irrational type of behavior, allow that to drive our decision making, because maybe we wouldn't be making the best decisions if we're not thinking, completely clearly.
Mm. I read something about you where you were referred to as a climate realist or climate realism. So maybe now at the end of our talk, what would be a realistic, or you could say scientific or open way to deal with the fact, I mean, we said it's probably a fact that the Earth is getting warmer and we are insecure about the reasons, but what would you suggest? What's a good way to deal with it?
So I think, climate realism comes from a little bit what we touched on earlier, the fact that if you enter this debate, often you're called a climate denier. And first of all, I don't even understand what that means. I don't understand how somebody can deny climate. That's like, can you deny the internet? I don't know. I don't even know if that means anything. So we, and denier obviously is trying to link people to Holocaust denial. I was actually born 2 hours from the gates of Auschwitz in Poland, in Wrocław in Poland. And so, I find that particularly kind of irking because I lost many of my family members. And so people were always trying to find new ways to kind of refer to them, climate skeptics. And so I think I like this idea of climate realism. So this just essentially means that we're taking the observable data and we're using that as our primary driver of predicting of the future rather than modeled assumptions. And so, I think that is a more honest way of looking at this. I would think that if you approached this, you wouldn't have as much climate anxiety if you approached it in this way. There's a recent study in Nature actually that the more people know about the environment, the less anxious they are about climate change, because there is this disconnect that we talked about. And so, if you really allow yourself to be open and to look at the entire picture, you would see that the climate is changing, and the climate has and will always change. I don't think our expectations as humans on the planet should ever be to control a natural process like that. I think that the unforeseen consequences of doing something like that would maybe be much more significant than not doing it. This is, for example, putting something to block sun in the atmosphere and things like that. I think if we look at our 2,000 or 5,000 years, whatever you want to make human civilization start, we are very successful on the planet, and as a species, for over 1 million years, we've gone through huge variations, multiple ice ages, and we survived as a species. We're very adaptable. And so we should understand that we're going to have to adapt. We're going to have challenges, but so far we've faced those challenges really well. We've done amazingly well at protecting human life from natural disasters. And I don't see that stopping. I see that continuing. I think humans are empathetic. I think, we should be working more to help developing countries protect themselves from natural disasters like we in the Western world are. But ultimately, I don't see any cause for crisis or emergency. And I warn people that when you're in crisis and emergency mode, the human brain doesn't work very well. When we're in fight or flight, we don't make good decisions. And we're planning for a future on a planet that we don't have another planet to go to. These are important decisions. We should be making these decisions with a clear mind, rationally, and not in some crisis or emergency mode, because we will make bad decisions if we're in this crisis mode.
That sounds like good words for for the final of our talk. Because I really agree. I don't think we can make good decisions if we are in fear. I mean, it's neuroscience also tells us that that's not something that is really doubtable. And so I'm really glad that you took the time and that we could have an hour talking about this complex issue. Me, myself, my work is about connecting people to nature, as you just said. And to me, it's always, I look at nature as something so complex, so deep, that I never would assume I could know, exactly know what's going on. And especially in climate, I'm not so deep into all the details, but I know that it's such a complex issue that whenever somebody comes to me and tells me we just need to do exactly this and this number, even without knowing all the facts, I'm like, I don't know, that seems too easy to make such a statement. So
yeah, it's reductionist, and unfortunately, to me, that complexity is the beauty of it. And so reducing it to this one thing, it just reduces it to from such a beautiful, complex system to, something that people just aren't really going to think about. And that's really the goal, right? Don't think about it. Just do this one thing. Because if you think about it, at least me, I got interested. I saw, wow, it's complex. It's so many moving parts. If you do this one thing, all these other things change. And look, these have negative consequences. These have positive consequences. And so, I think that's part of the beauty, but I understand why to package it, to change policy, you package it into this one little tiny thing and you say, this is what we need to do. And this will be the beautiful outcomes. And, ultimately, I don't think that anybody really believes that.
All right. So thanks for your time and all the best for your work with the Substack. I will give a link to your Substack and to the things we talked about under this video so people can research and look it up what we said here. And yeah, all the best to you and see you soon.
Thanks for having me. All right. Thank you.